Hello, everyone. Welcome to 3 Talks in 3 Days on Design for Climate Adaptation. I'm Billy Fairclough, co-chair for the forthcoming panel on Design for Climate Adaptation at the World Congress of Architects, UIA 2023 in Copenhagen. And I'm joining you today from Philadelphia. Majbrit Pedersen-Zari, my co-chair, is joining from Auckland, New Zealand. And Majbrit is an associate professor in the School of Future Environments at Auckland University of Technology. So today is day 3 of our event. And today I'm going to facilitate a talk with our guests on design for climate adaptation through behavior change and action. But I want to talk a little bit first about this upcoming event. So these 3 talks, these 3 days of talks, and others actually that will follow throughout the year are precursors to the 28th World Congress of Architects convening in Copenhagen 1 year from now on July 2nd through 6th. And the World Congress is a sizable triennial event, and it will bring together a broad group of people under the theme Sustainable Futures, Leave No One Behind. It will promote, discuss, create, and showcase architecture, landscape architecture, planning as a vital tool to achieve the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. 2023 also marks the midway point between the launch of the SDGs in 2016 and their completion in 2030. So the World Congress aims to build a platform to consolidate, to connect, to synergize international research. So within the World Congress and specifically within the science track, there are going to be 6 panels. So design for climate adaptation is one of the 6. Design for rethinking resources, design for resilient communities, design for health, design for inclusivity, design for partnerships of change are also chaired. And we invite everyone to look at the website and to think through all of the different panels and all of the different topics that will be presented in 2023. This specific panel, Design for Climate Adaptation, addresses the profound urgency with which global communities are acting and adapting to Earth's changing climate. The built environment is the most common habitat of humans. It should interact with Earth's ecosystems and climates in a sustainable and regenerative way, and it should nurture people, particularly the most vulnerable. As ecosystem collapse globally cascades, who is adapting, why, how, and at what scale? Within the climate adaptation panel at UIA 2023, we're emphasizing 7 sub-themes. Themes along the lines of adaptation with indigenous knowledges, adaptation through frameworks, adaptation through feedback, adaptation through architectural technologies, adaptation through nature-based solutions, adaptation through behavior change, and adaptation through action. So within these 7 themes, we are asking a series of questions, and we are inviting reflection on all of these themes and inviting your research. So again, we encourage you to look at the UIA 2023 website. All of these themes, in addition to all of the panels, are described there in detail. This panel in particular prioritizes the realization of new types of knowledge that's co-created, but it also emphasizes local knowledge, tacit knowledge, explicit knowledge associated with projects and demonstrations and outcomes. And the arc of the panel as designed emphasizes knowledge, actions, and outcomes, but also respects the complexity therein. The 3 talks that we've elevated across these three days have focused on the themes of adaptation with indigenous knowledges. And you can find that talk online via YouTube. You can also find our talk from yesterday, Adaptations for Nature-Based Solutions. And today's talk, Adaptations for Behavior Change and Action, again, elevates one of the themes that we feel we need to have more of an open conversation on. So the aim of these 3 talks really is to introduce to you, the audience, the purpose and promise of the UIA science track, but also to really introduce the theme of design for climate adaptation. We're trying to initiate an interdisciplinary conversation today and identify who's missing from it. And we want to hear from you about these different themes and these different talks and really confirm support for and relevance of the proposed panel themes for 2023. And lastly, I want to emphasize that the call for papers for UIA 2023 is out. There is a deadline for abstracts in a couple of weeks on the 20th of June. The deadline for full papers is on the 3rd of October. But as a reminder, abstract submissions are not required. And the presentation of papers will occur again 2nd through 6th of July in 2023. We are accepting a range of paper types, and that's quite intentional to recognize the range of different approaches to research. So expository writing in the form of original research, but also narrative essays in the form of oral histories or storytelling, visual essays, and argumentative essays that put forth new concepts. All of this research will be supported and presented at UIA 2023. So before we begin, I'd like to turn this over to Majpreet to open our conversation, and then I'll proceed from there to introduce our panelists.
Kia ora, everybody. In the country I live, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we often start events like this with a karakia as a way to bring focus to a particular event. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to start, and I'll do another karakia to close. Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho, tuia ki te here tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, tihei, mauri ora.
Thank you, Majpreet. All right, so our discussion today, adaptation through behavior change and action. And we're joined by Klaus Leonhardt, Gail Brager, and Fabrizio Chica, who are, I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves individually and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. Before I do that, though, I want to say hello to our guests that are joining us on Zoom. We encourage you to put any of your questions in the Q&A, but we also have guests who are joining us on YouTube and on Bilibili. So welcome to the event. And again, looking forward to a robust discussion on this topic, adaptation through behavior change and action. When we set up this topic, Majpreet and I discussed quite a bit about how behavior change and action takes us from this idea of knowledge to demonstration to action to outcome. So really, how do we understand our intent? What are we aiming towards when we look at the intersection between design, behavior, and action? So when we began to describe this particular theme, we were aiming to investigate design strategies that support and challenge human behavior, but also ones that actually elevate individuals and communities that witness or are impacted by or directly respond to climate change. And in our guests' work, we see various ways of talking about, interacting with, in thinking through the complexity of behavior change and action. So we are really excited that you're here, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and ask you to introduce yourself. So Gail, I was wondering, can I start with you?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name's Gail Brager. I'm an engineer by training and professor of architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm also the associate director of the Center for the Built Environment, CBE, which is a research consortium with over 50 industry partners that represent diverse stakeholders in the building industry. And Kieran Timberlake is one of our valued partners, and Billy has been a very active member. So it's always fun to have an opportunity to work with you directly, Billy. So I'll just briefly, two highlights of my research that I think are directly related to today's session. One with my colleague, Richard Didier from University of Sydney. We developed the adaptive thermal comfort model for naturally ventilated and mixed mode buildings. And the second one, more current, is I am in the final months of completing a book about designing for multi-sensory experiences and stronger connection to nature. And while these are all inherently low energy approaches to try to mitigate a climate crisis, they also begin with a motivation to create delight for people and in turn better stewardship of our buildings and planet. because I believe that addressing the climate crisis and addressing experiential delight really can go hand in hand.
Thanks, Gail. Fabrizio.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here, particularly because it's very hard for an architect. I'm an architect who teaches at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. It's very hard to talk about behavior. We talk a lot about technology. We talk a lot about impact. We talk a lot about efficiency, but we do not talk about behavior, how people use these spaces, right? And for me, every forum and every opportunity that I have to talk about behavior is great, because that's what my research is. So I'm academic at the moment, but I'm not really an academic. I came from the market. I have a very pragmatic way to approach things. I was an architect. I worked in the real estate industry for many years in 6 different countries. And then I changed my life. I got back to university in 2009 because I was feeling uncomfortable with my career. And I went to university to develop a way to measure environmental impact in subdivisions. And it was very interesting because I was going through infrastructure, I was going through energy, I was going through water. And halfway through my PhD, I figured out that the most important thing by far is the user. Despite of infrastructure, is the way that you use. And I got into the conclusion, and now putting into architecture, that there is no sustainable building. What exists is an efficient building with sustainable people. So people has this very special way to damage the way that we design. So we create a very sustainable building with everything possible to make sustainable, and people are very creative to make the building unsustainable. So from that point on, I changed my research. And it's tough because sometimes it goes against architects, goes against my colleagues, because while they are designing things to make people behave in the same way with less impact, that's philosophic, what part of academia is doing at the moment, designing buildings where people behave in the same way with less impact. My research goes in a different way, goes to provoke people to use the building in a different way, to have less impact, and hopefully the building will be more efficient. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm teaching the paper they're going to start next semester in some weeks is sustainable architecture, where I give a building to the students and I say, hey, without designing anything, make this building sustainable. And it's very interesting, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, so much to unpack. Klaus, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, sure. Well, first of all, I'm really delighted to be here. To have to say today or tonight. I mean, this is actually a planetary coalition right now. So, right, which is amazing, and which I think so much suits the topic, to think planetary. And I think my planetary thinking started, somewhere in between my architectural practice after I studied architecture in Germany, and I understood that the discipline of architecture always felt to me limited in that sense, that it didn't address the planetary aspect in terms of air, of atmosphere, of life, of vegetation, of all of that. And so that kind of unleashed this urge to go into landscape architecture. So I was trained also as a landscape architect in the United States, and doing that, I felt suddenly much more complete. In really understanding that this bridging of professional knowledge is not complicating my practice, but amazingly enriching. And I think this is also, of course, what I would like to share a little bit tonight in terms of what does it mean to bridge disciplines. What does this mean for academia? Still, we are talking about transdisciplinary work, but how can we really integrate this into our mindsets, into our thought spaces? Besides, of course, this curiosity that emerges when somebody else is in the room that talks in a almost different language, and you feel like, oh, whoa, my universe expands in that moment. When my universe expanded, in Gail, I have to reach over to you, to California, to think about, the redwood forests. I visited the redwood forest quite some years ago, actually north of San Francisco, Muir Woods. And I was just struck by the climate performance. Simply, it was a very hot day, and I moved along those, ridges. It was very open landscape. It was hot and pretty dry. And then descending down to Muir Woods, the climate changed really instantly. And I realized, this is not just a landscape. This is really a system of climate that, has to its core what I actually call a plant technology. And I on purpose talk about technology in the context of living vegetation, to also get the bridge to what we call technology. As the redwoods are taking out the fog through osmosis from the air. And if that is not a technology, and a very advanced technology, so what then is technology? And I think, thinking about this in terms of technology, it really allowed me to bridge this aspect of what I call plant performance, into my architectural thinking. And so I'm sure we have some more moments to go a little bit deeper into those aspects.
So thank you. You've opened up so many threads of thoughts around this topic, and I want to begin by helping us all wrestle a bit more with this question of behavior. So we purposely put this theme inside the climate adaptation panel, because we knew it was actually quite important for us to acknowledge the work, the research, the thinking that is happening within a larger community, to understand the role of our individual and collective behavior in responding to climate change. So how do we understand that? And what I see in your collective work are different ways in to wrestling with understanding behavior. And so I wondered if we could just sort of zoom out a little bit and talk at a pretty high level about why is it important to understand the role of our individual and collective behavior in responding to climate change, or responding to a changing climate. Gail,
Sure.
do you want to start with that one?
I'll start with that. I really like this prompt, and I have to say I did not have an immediate reaction to it, and I realized I had to sort of think about unpacking it a bit, because the way we think about the word adaptation in buildings is different than the way we talk about it when we apply it to us as human beings. And so I thought about it in two main ways. Each has its own answer to the question of importance. So the first one is modifying behavior to mitigate climate change, right? But how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And this, of course, involves our own patterns of resource consumption, from the foods we eat to transportation, or reducing energy use in buildings, which is where my focus has been. So we know building design plays a huge role in that, but technology and policy can only go so far, and people's attitudes and behavior are critically important in terms of whether those designed low energy strategies are even going to be utilized once the designer and builder walk away. So for this first category, I think behavioral change is really essential to just reversing our addiction to air conditioning, which is what it is. It is an addiction. and the amount of energy we use. And then the second category is that whereas we can think about behavior in terms of mitigating climate change, we can also think about behavior in terms of adaptation. So how to soften the impacts of the already warming climate on our own comfort, health, and well-being. It's here, it's coming, it's already happening. So from the building perspective, we think about mitigation and adaptation. And from the building perspective, adaptation is about designing for resilience and passive survivability during periods of power outages or extreme heat waves. But from the people perspective, I see behavior as one of three types of this idea of adaptation. And one of them is physiological, and what we often call climatization, how our physiological set points from which we start sweating or vasodilation and constriction actually change. The second one is psychological, or habitation. How do we, how does our experience of changing climate change our expectations, our tolerances, maybe even our preferences for more variable climate? And this is part of what the adaptive comfort model is about. And then the third one, behavior. Behavior is one of the three, and behavior is, I see this as our ability to either adjust our personal activities, our clothing, or reach out and modify elements of the building that affect our environment, something that's been being called adaptive opportunity, the idea of agency. And this is really important because our ability to actively engage with our buildings is actually an essential element of our ability to accept these wider temperature swings. Rather than it being thrust upon us, if we are an active agent in interacting with our building and understanding why it's warm because we're in a heat wave rather than the chiller broken, that direct engagement, that changes our attitudes from tolerating to maybe even enjoying the variety. So I think behavioral changes really are important because they need to be seen in an integrated way of how we both design and operate and inhabit buildings, and as an integrated way to enhance our experience, not be seen as a sacrifice for a greater good, which we also need to do, but that's not going to be the motivation.
Those descriptions, those definitions were or the categorizations was actually really helpful. I wish I had a whiteboard. We could start writing all these things down. Why didn't we do this? But this is a talk. It's meant to be a talk. So Fabrizio, you were very clear at this, like there's this moment in your own work where you centralize behavior. And I'm sure, in terms of the answer to this question, like, why is it important to understand the role of our individual and collective behavior in responding to a changing climate? It sounds like that's something that you've been thinking about continuously from the moment that you had this sort of like, wait, aha, like this
every day, every minute,
every day.
Yeah, and because it's a fight, it's a struggle, because it goes often against what has been developed at university, for example, because challenge the knowledge in a different way. I'm not saying I'm right, I'm saying I'm challenging, which is good. I like to challenge things. But what Gail said, for me, it's very, very critical, because if you start to enjoy the weather change, you're going to have to challenge, for example, dressing cold. You cannot work in tie and suit, I'm from Brazil, and for 10 years, I was taking a bus with 42 degrees. I'm sorry if you guys are in Fahrenheit, but it's very hot. It's like 100-ish in a bus, in tie and suit, and no air conditioning, sweat, and that's my dressing code. It's a change that we have to address. But still getting what Gail said, and trying to answer your question, the click came when we were talking about houses, and an example that we start thinking in New Zealand, in many developed countries, you can do that. We can buy 100% energy, renewable energy. Our supply can provide all the source of energy and can be 100% sustainable. So there's a story of a family that decided to make huge changes in their house. We suffer here in New Zealand with our homes. They are very badly designed. The materials are horrible. They're leaking. They are very cold in the winter. So the energy expenditures are very high among families. And this family, this particular family, made a huge effort to change their habits, to address the energy problems that they have, to install solar panels and become 100% renewable. And they managed to save $9,300 New Zealand dollars, something around 7,000 American dollars a year. And to celebrate, they flew from New Zealand to Los Angeles to celebrate, 5 people. So they essentially offset everything that they saved with this travel, because they have an air flight with the money that they saved, and they were buying 100% renewable energy for one of the suppliers. So if we do not change this habit, the architecture design effort is lost, because it doesn't matter if you save in a house, but you don't save in your overall impact. So that was a change. And I said, okay, hold on. We need to think out of the architectural container. And what Klaus said about the universe expand, that was one. I had one 2 days ago when Daniel Glenn was talking in the very same forum, and he mentioned, I'm kind of quoting, I didn't have time to write down, but he said something, a profound change in the way that we live, respecting what has been done for thousands of years. And then after that, I went to read stuff. I said, okay, let's see, that was the second one. And I had the third one, perhaps the largest one, as I promised before, was this one here. Ta-da, my daughter. That was my universe expanding. And you know why? So this photo I took like 4 weeks ago. She's not a year old yet. And when I came home and I put the black and white, I figured out that she will be around in 2100. That's not the future anymore. That's her. That's my daughter. I won't be, but she will be. So if we keep tackling the problem as it's only an architectural design problem, is not a behavior, entire conceptual problem, that you have to change the way that you handle the temperature change, that you have to change the way that we dress, that we eat, and everything is one single thing that starts with the way that you behave, we are not sorting out the problem. It will not sort it, particularly because conceptually and philosophically, and I'm sorry because of my generalization, and I know particularly what Klaus is going to show us, that's not to everyone, but there is something very, very strong in academia today, and not only in academia for architecture, but in different areas. Our effort, our collective effort, the majority of our collective effort, not all, is to keep us doing exactly the same that we have been doing with less impact. We are not keen to make huge changes. We are coming up with electric car, which is great. We're reducing emissions, but we're still driving more than we should. There was a huge celebration some years ago, another example, a little bit out of architecture, but I hope everyone here can make the connections by themselves. There was a huge, huge celebration in some cities in Europe because of the dramatic reduction in cars ownership, which was great. So we are not buying cars. On the other hand, there was a dramatic increase in car use despite of public transportation, because people start using Uber or whatever app they're currently available to get cars. So before, a teenager, and then I have a few personal examples here at university as well. 10 years ago, my students, the majority of my students would come to the campus either walking or by public transportation. I have a huge chunk of students now, they're coming to university. They don't have a car, but they use a car. This is the technology operating, right, in a way that we don't change our habits, which kind of reduce the environmental impact. The car ownership is debatable because we need to really measure the environmental impact of both. But there was always a trick thing, and that's the same with architecture. Rebound effect is something real in architecture. And besides, there is, if you don't change people's behavior, and that's what I'm researching at the moment. So you create a very efficient building, which would have a very low environmental impact, but the user, as Gail was said, doesn't interact with the building, doesn't understand what's happening there, simply is having a low environmental impact, this individual has to use only efficient buildings. Otherwise, they will not know how to behave in different buildings that are not as efficient as that one. And the impact is going to be larger because we're not changing the behavior. We are making people use the building in the same way. And I ask everyone, I apologize to everyone that research in a different way. And I know there are some researchers that do, but the vast majority, the technology is there, is not being used to change our habits, is being used to change the impact of our use and improves. But if we go through the data today and you see the dramatic change that has to happen in human behavior in every single level, technology is not helping, is not enough, is far to be enough. We need a dramatic change.
So Klaus, Klaus, I'm really curious about your response to this question, the importance of understanding the role of individual and collective behavior. Because the next question we're going to go to is showing the audience examples of your work, or talking about examples of your work. But you've spent a lot of your work and a lot of your thought life, as you introduced yourself, really considering the interface between architecture and landscape, and the systems relationships between the two, and the atmospheres that are created between the two. And every time when I was looking at your work, I was thinking about how the person is situated within that work, within those experiences, I should say. Even the description that you gave of walking in through the redwood forest, there's a person there that's experiencing that atmosphere. So I'm curious, from your perspective and from your body of work, how do you begin to understand the importance of individual and collective behavior in responding to climate change?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and it's such a joy to listen to you, Gail, and Fabrizio, and I feel like I just need to add, and it's it's really like we're building something here, and so please, everybody listening, recall what just Fabrizio and Gail said, and I'll put it on top right now in again talking about behavior and asking my fundamental question, which is, okay, who behaves? And for me, I have to really probably throw this in again and again, which is I see the world as a more than human world, and for me, not only humans behave, but everything behaves in that regard. And in unpacking this notion of behavior, I found that, of course, behavior is a practice. And it's always about an action, or even better, an interaction, right? So, and this here we are, it's an interaction between things and humans, between stones and trees, between, climate and atmosphere, between, oceans and rivers. And so for me, this behavior, I would like to really take it already large to, even find something within it in terms of, who's responding in behavior to whom, and is it, you could discuss it on a policy level, like humans respond to policy. This would be this interaction, or me responding to the microclimate of the forest. And so I think there are so many levels, right, of how you can understand this issue of behavior and how you address it, how you speak about it. Is it enabling when we talk about behavior, or is it limiting? Am I being limited? And of course, my experience of the forest is enabling. It's not limiting. And there is for me already the key towards how I understand this topic of behavior and how we could implement change of behavior. Ideally, once it is inspirational, right? When it is opening, our universe. When, as Gail just, shared with us, people experience, the change of climate as something enabling, as inspiring, instead of the constantly, the same atmosphere and air temperature through, climatization. And I think that is really the key for me, this inspiration, even the spiritual part, in terms of how come ideas to us, how do we feel inspired by what when I'm in the forest. I think there's so many beautiful aspects, when behavioral, let's say, change is an inspiring process or practice.
Can I just jump
go.
in, because I'm so inspired by what both of you just said, but Klaus, especially the way you had a very ecological way of framing this, which I think is so important, because we often work within the silos of our disciplines. When we think about behavior, some people might go, okay, the person is just behaving. And no, it's everything. That I love the way you talked about the interactions, because we are both inspired by our natural environment, our indoor environment. We want to interact with it, either in response to it or to try to modify it. But that engagement and connection to the rhythms of nature, I think, is a really important way to inspire people to behave in responsible ways. So I just really like the way you framed that.
And we have really expanded out this definition, and I want to ask you all to share a bit of your work with the audience. Let's go ahead and do that. So Klaus, can we start with you? Can you just tell us a little bit about the work that you do, the types of projects that you do, and perhaps a little bit about the project scale, their ambition, and the kind of outcomes that you seek in your work, and what do you advocate for in your work?
Well, thank you for giving me the space to share a little bit what certainly not I do, but what we do. And I hope you can see my screen now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so first of all, this is a team effort, as always. And I haven't been speaking about my academic practice, and I think we all are bridges here in the room right now, in terms of bridging disciplines and spaces of thought that have somehow been framed professionally and put into a box, because it's quite convenient, and you can be very efficient when you work in a box, right? Because you don't have to care about what happens outside. And I think this is in part, the amazing, let's say, quality of Western science, that you can really go deep and uncover amazing knowledge. And as we know, technology is especially emerging out of that vertical, going into the depth of a certain field. But the horizontal part, in terms of connecting the different fields, is, I think, what is really emerging in the last decades, and even the environmental issue comes out of that, right? Because we understand that through making relations between fields and actions and processes, we realize, there is an interaction between our action on the planet and change on a planetary scale. And so I'm taking, with my work at the Institute of Architecture and Landscape that I had at the University of Graz in Austria, we started already like 10 years ago in looking at the systemic aspects of design, and really integrating the plant world as a protagonist in understanding what are they doing, what is their practice, what is their behavior, so to say, how do we interact, and really elevating not only the plant world, but basically everything. You can also say the microclimate is a protagonist. Of course, biodiversity is a protagonist as such. And I'm looking at this diagram right now. So really looking at a sphere of protagonists that all interact, and we aim to give them a voice. And through giving voice to the more than human world, suddenly you really realize not only the behavioral inspiration through these interactions, which actually not only go in one direction but in all directions. This becomes really what became really the field of design for us. For instance, the notion of performance that I'm using for planned performance, always, I introduce this to my students and saying, hey, there is form in performance, right? Literally, when you read the word. So, let's uncover the form, the shape making, the aesthetics of the performative aspect. And so in our work, we really, trying to, and you see on the bottom of this diagram, the 70 UN SDGs, and on the top, you see this sphere of our engagement. We're saying, yeah, I mean, we can't, we believe that we can't solve, individual SDGs, but it's a system of interaction, of behavioral exchange on so many levels that are really hard to articulate, but nevertheless they exist. And our approach is in specific projects like what you see here is a graphic on a project that is called the Breathing Headquarters. It's a project that is about 12,000 square meters at size when you look at the building part, and the entire. But we looked at the entire landscape as a breathing system, and understanding that, of course, the microbiome of the landscape and the microbiome of the building, for instance, are in constant exchange. And so we really started to work with the principle of this dynamic exchange of the performative aspects, and saying, well, we will not distinguish between inside and outside in that regard, in this dualistic separation of the architectural part, which creates an inside, and then there's the landscape which is assigned to an outside. But in confusing that on purpose, we said, why shouldn't the building start breathing and take on the capacities of that forest that I was just sharing with you in the beginning? And through that claim, simply, really this idea emerged that our buildings breathe. They are being cooled by the planned performance. There's no air conditioning, although there is already simulation for the next 30 years of climate change. And with that approach, this new understanding of what an interior is or an exterior is completely confused. And you see here on purpose an image that is photographed through an indoor courtyard, and in the back you can see some kind of interior. And that confusion between interior and exterior, creates an amazing new, kind of space. Where we are really beyond this category of, are you now inside or outside? And this doesn't matter anymore, because suddenly it's an experience of space, of atmosphere, of climate, and of of changing seasons, even, right? Again, to make this reference towards, hey, let's go beyond climatization, but really embrace the different seasons, and just allow them to also kind of touch us as humans. And so let's see. So this building is plastic free, 90.8%, and it is breathing, as I said, through augmented plant performance. I can go into that a little bit later. Whenever I visit my clients in this building, They feel like coming out of a yoga session because they feel so grounded and calm. And I felt like I missed my yoga session yesterday, and they are living it basically. And that is exactly what I think we have to look at when we look at behavior in terms of interaction. Design has this amazing capacities to invite us to behave in a certain way, and I think that capacities to really unfold is what I'm very much looking forward for the next coming years.
Oh, you've answered so many parts and aspects of the questions that we have. Design has the capacity to, I think you said, invite us to behave. Gail, I want to turn it over to you. Could you share with us a bit about your work?
Yes, this is, I mean, I'm just seeing all these connections between us. So what do I challenge people to do? I challenge our society's addiction to air conditioning. I mentioned that phrase, and I do believe that this is a real problem for us. And I think it's because conventional practices move towards this centralized conditioning and basically an experiential goal that if people don't notice, then that's a good thing, right? The Western goal seems to be creating static, uniform environments that nobody notices. And I call that experiential monotony. So instead, throughout my work, I advocate for moving away from that. I advocate for the opposite of creating rich, variable, multisensory environments that we do notice. And we notice because they make us feel good. So many of our standards are about reducing the negative, right? No complaints, job is done. My work starts from no complaints and moves upward, right? How do we create delight, and how do we start with being very intentional about what we want those experiences to be as part of an experiential programming, if you will? Because I think if you're not intentional about what you want those experiences to be, how do you know whether you've been successful or not? Now, to connect that to climate change, all of my work has been at the intersection of energy performance and indoor environmental quality. I think all design and operational goals for buildings, you have to do that hand in hand. But I think trying to use BTOs and carbon emissions as the motivator has really not worked very well. I've been working on that argument for decades. And my feeling now is that if we start with experience as the common denominator and then advocate for these rich experiences, but in ways that connect us to nature and don't use as much energy, I think that's where you get people excited. And then it's like, oh, by the way, we're going to reduce carbon too. But I no longer think that needs to be the starting point. I think we need to start with the idea of experience and how we want to feel. So you asked about outcomes as an educator and a researcher. My outcomes is about bridging research and design, and whether it's publications that are accessible to a lay audience, design tools, changing standards, creating design guidelines. How do we get away from our silos of communication and get these worlds to talk to each other? And CBE is a great example of that, as Billy knows, that we feel like the best way to make a real impact on buildings is to work directly with those diverse stakeholders. So our partners, our stakeholders are architects and engineers and developers and contractors and manufacturers, utilities, government organizations, even big building owners who maybe their products and services aren't about buildings, but they have, like Google's one of our partners, they have a lot of real estate. They want to know, how can we make buildings better for people and the planet?
Fabrizio, your work, can you share with us a bit about the work that you do?
Yes. So can you guys see?
Yes.
Yeah, and this is my previous book. I'm just finished one 3 weeks ago. It's been produced. Is a continuation of this one. This one, everyday lifestyle and sustainability, the environmental impact of doing the same things in a different way. So this book was a collection of small research, sorry. And it started with my partner writing this book, Brenda Vail and Robert Vail. They wrote this book, Time to Be the Dog, The Real Guide of Sustainable Living, where they measure environmental impact of hundreds, perhaps thousands of things. Another book, Living Within a Fair Share of Ecological Footprint, and then my PhD, where I tried to measure urban areas. So this book or this research is essentially visiting families, researchers are visiting families and measuring everything that these people were doing for a week. What they were eating, what they're dressing, how they move around, how they warm or cool their houses, everything. So this is me in India with the family after a week with them, not literally in the same house. I was outside their houses and measuring everything. And it was done for many families. The book is divided into parts. The first part is this assessment. In total, we had 24 families in 21 different countries. The second part of the book, we compare. We measure the environmental impact of each family. Of course, we have to extrapolate in some cases because the climate and winter, and we have to collect more data. For example, in countries that have very cold winter and very hot summer, so we have to collect the data for the year round. And we measure all of them. So this is the breadth of the research. So this is the countries that we covered, and the exercise was very important for my understanding of the problem, because essentially after 3 years producing this book and this research, I start to understand even more the impact of the behavior, right? Because essentially we try somehow to get similar families, a normal couple with kids, right? We couldn't get for all the countries, but that's what we tried, we aimed. And people have very similar tasks, but they execute in a different way. So people wake up earlier and they feed their kids go to school, they go to work. And all little things, when you combine and you start to understand what we measure energy, we measure transportation, we measure the house, the shelter, the consumer goods that they had, the way that they eat. We start to get out of the small container that we normally are, working within the boundaries of the building or the boundaries of the neighborhood, the region. And we start to understand that environmental impact, isolated and addressed in an isolated form, will not be enough to sort out our problems. If we get what we are going through at the moment in terms of environmental impact, and if we start to look at the situation that we are in terms of environmental impact, we're going to see, for example, this image here for the climate action tracker that show us how the countries are performing trying to reach the Paris Agreement goals. And according to this website, which is a very robust research, none of the countries are getting there. Nobody, no country in the world is achieving what has been promised in the Paris Agreement so far. So it's time for more urgent way to tackle. So my research is and I got very happy to hear more people saying exactly the same. We have to break these walls of the building and stop talking about the building, only the building. As a designers, and I remember when I was at university last century, right? The first week of the at the university, I got a plan of a house and a guide how to use a house. You have to open the windows in the rain, blah, 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 blah. We don't do that anymore. Haven't seen. And I have been in different countries. I taught in different countries, and I haven't seen, no matter how developed the country is or underdeveloped. We don't see that anymore. We are not tackling the problem in a way that we should. Architects, as designers, we are more than building producers. We are educators of good architecture. And when you talk about educators of good architecture, now is not about the quality of the style, is the impact of the building and the impact of people that are using the building. Because we get back to example that I said about energy. The family saved money for energy, and then they offset everything that they saved in a travel to US, and the emissions are higher. They should kept what they had instead of change the building because they had more impact. They saved $10,000. They have no knowledge of environment. They got out of the building, and they had more impact than before because we are not teaching. We are delivering a building that more efficient. So when we start talking about behavior, when we start challenge what we are producing, what we are doing in terms of architecture, the way that we are producing our students, the architects, because when I face this discussion in the market, in the academia, I'm forgiven some of the times. But when I talk to the market, I'm not. I'm grilled every time that I say that. And we have examples in a sustainability week some years ago at university, when a famous architect in New Zealand came to the campus and he said, oh, that's not my problem anymore. They are saving energy from the building, and that's it. That's my role. He said that. And when I talked to my students a week later, because I was that semester, I was teaching sustainability to my students. My students start challenging everything that I said for 12 weeks because the guy said, why are you saying that? Because that famous architect, he came here and he said that you shouldn't care. It's just the building. So it's very important in a forum that has a strong contact with architecture, with academia, to start to provoke a discussion that's more complex, way more complex than save energy, is challenge the way that we are teaching people to understand the environment using or not using architecture. That's my research.
That's really helpful, and I think I want to take you up on this question of teaching. Also, the type of knowledge that we're talking about. I mean, a lot of what we're discussing is, let's say, at the intersection between experience, but also the intersection between tacit and explicit knowledge. So, how we know our environments, how we inhabit our environments. There is a role of a tacit understanding of our behavior as it sort of produces whatever results that we're looking for. But I want to go to teaching, because I know even in my own research, there are ways that we can manifest behaviors through teaching. So I'm just wondering if we could just talk a little bit about how do you teach the relationship between adaptation behavior? How do you make that manifest for your students? Is there some sort of go-to example?
It's very, very hard. It's very hard. First, Victoria University of Wellington has a very strong building science program, which I'm the director of building science program anyway, which is heavily based on technology, modeling, right? How buildings behave using certain materials of certain orientation and so on, which is, I've never said that it's not important. I always say that it's not enough. It's very important, but it's not enough. So how I take that on, I spend an entire semester, because the students have other courses talking about technology. And then it comes to my course, the challenge is you have to make the building without designing anything. You have to make the building sustainable without designing anything. So I give them, I design a quick, simple building with a lot of problems in terms of efficiency. And I ask them to produce something that is not designed, which is challenge the way that people use the building. And this is something that is very important, because when we ask the students, or when you ask an architect out of academia or a student by itself, we are not asking the fundamental question that should be asked by everyone that's concerned about environment more than architecture, is that building necessary? Because when we are giving to someone a design, the assumption is that building is necessary, and there is a certain code of use that we are implicitly using. For example, if designing an office building, it means that the way that people use the building is kind of preset. We know that, there will be desks and there will be 2 meeting rooms. So it limits our capacity to challenge the way that people work, challenge the way that people behave inside that space. So at academia, the education about sustainability has to come before the architecture itself. Because if you give the building and you already have all the building's problems there, or the building program, the students already have the definition of what has to be there, and the capacity to challenge the way that people use the building is limited. So in my understanding is try to teach the students, or try to provoke the students to think that design is one of the ways, but it's not the only way to make people sustainable. And second one is push the understanding that sustainability is more important than architecture, and sustainability has to be ahead of architecture. So if you know the environmental impact that you produce, right? And if you don't think that your house is sustainable, therefore you are sustainable, because that's what people out of university thinks. And then you can provoke the students to design something that considers sustainability as a holistic way. And then they're probably going to start challenging the way that we sleep, the way that you work, the way that we move around, the way that we share space. Because that's the fundamental question that goes to the design in a more practical studio-based teaching is, are we prepared to challenge the students in a way that people use the space? Like there are no more kitchens, private kitchens. Every kitchen in this building would be shared between 6 families. Right?
So So in many ways, your approach really begins with inhabitation, patterns of inhabitation, and their meaning. And Gail, the work at the CBE is very much focused on understanding that, and then elevating that as something that we can understand, creating knowledge about how we inhabit our buildings. I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you teach this relationship? How do you make it manifest to those in the CBE and those who are part of this much larger consortium who are very concerned about this issue?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that it's very difficult. I have increasingly been hearing the term inhabitation rather than just occupants, and I think that's there's power in subtle differences in semantics. And for me, I love that word because it really does start to invoke an interaction. And like Fabricio said, we focus a lot on the technology. So we've kind of got the building science and the direct experience. But the way I like to teach is to always be connecting them. So whether we're talking about the climate responsive strategies as a way to reduce energy and giving them physical principles and analysis tools and design precedents and all of that, I always want to connect the message of here's how the physical building performs, but then here's how it connects to how we experience the sensory environments of thermal and lighting and acoustics that I'll talk about how energy efficient design starts with climate responsive design, which is driven by comfort responsive design. So we need to understand how people respond to the environment. But then in terms of some sort of go-to examples, one of my favorite ones is a series of exercises where they're going to design like a highway rest stop, something that is temporary inhabitation. right? That you could pass through. It's not about complying with ASHRAE standards and uniformity. It's a place where you're passing through, you want to connect to the climate, but have relief. But the way I do it is I start with, I think personal experience and observation is incredibly important to almost anything that you teach. There has to be hands-on experience. They need to see buildings or landscapes as living labs where they experience them directly and they notice things. So I go through a series of what I call like thermal consciousness raising exercises, where they might for a week keep a thermal journal. I give them instruments to measure things, but it's more about record your observations, your interactions, your experiences, see if it jives with or contradicts what the numbers are telling you, but tell us your story and tell us about your aha moments and where did you find delight and where did you have to cope and find escape. And then I ask them to translate those into experiential programming for their designs before they design anything. Now try to describe as if you're talking to a blind person. Don't tell me about dimensions. Don't tell me about physical space. Tell me about what the light space and the thermal space and the acoustic space felt like for you. And then tell me what you want your design spaces to feel like. They might do a day in the life story of imagine this family with cranky children and an exhausted driver pulling up to this rest stop, and then tell a story about what that sensory transition is going to be and what you want them to feel like and how you want them to feel refreshed by the time they got in the car. And then finally, how are you going to design for those experiences?
So Klaus, I feel like that's a perfect segue to you. And I'm really curious. There was a moment in one of your talks that's available online where you talk about the role of feeling and touching as the way of measuring rather than explicitly measuring. And I never got to get to measuring a little later. I don't know if you remember that you said that even, but I'm really curious about teaching as well. And you know, Gail, you just sort of bridge these two realms of sensory experience, but also the ability to measure, but then also describe, to storytell, but then be really explicit about interpreting the story that you told. Klaus, how do you teach this relationship? Do you bridge the two or something else entirely? Oh, we can't hear you.
So here we go. Yes, of course, and I have to also agree it's difficult. And why is it difficult? Because of the curriculum, I would say. It's not an issue that we can't teach, but it needs time and space. And I think that is really the only issue. Really, I think we have designed a perfect curriculum that is focusing on a narrow idea of what architecture is. And my amazing colleagues at the institute, they are putting in all of their capacities to fit all of those aspects into a semester, as we do right now. Of course, I would like to share actually a diagram that shows a little bit how we approach these issues that we are discussing right now, which is, we have a global topic, obviously. We have a global concern, and in terms of our behavior, which is here on the bottom line, you see on the left on the diagram, you see the I, which accounts for the eye level. This is us in our everyday practice. And you see on the right, you see micro-practicing, which means micro practices, or this is what we do, how we act, who we are, and to really teach how that relates to the environment, to the region, or to the planet, is what we are aiming for, and nothing less. And what Gail just shared with us, which is designing actually micro stories. That's what we do. We ask the students to to pack a certain practice into a story, and because storytelling has this amazing capacity, to bring a complex task into, a linear structure of the narrative, and suddenly, it's quite easy to explain, a complex issue. So, those micro practices in terms of what, how landscapes perform, what your own practice in terms of when you design a building with a certain program, how that affects the environment, the more narrow one or the larger one. When we explain that through micro stories, suddenly, the global dimension emerges in that. And basically in one breath of that story, you can capture that moment of connectivity of this larger issue of planetary issues, with your everyday practice. That the diagram here also shows on the top left, it shows a camera, and it says, it's the view from above. And so my concern is also in terms of being interested in policy making, right? How policy very often has this view of the camera from above, right? And we look down and say, you have to change your behavior down there. And of course, that is likely to fail if we don't really understand what Fabrizio just shared so beautifully, what really happens on eye level, on the everyday practice that we do. And so I think what our story is in our teaching is that we constantly go back and forth between those scales and aspects. So you can't just stay on the eye level, and you certainly can't stay on the level in just looking down on a certain topic. I would just share with you, let's say, the sphere of our research that we could, publish during, last year's lockdown. And it is our investigation about, the planetary capacity of air and atmosphere to really reconceptualize, our, human being on the planet. And for us, really, as we're talking about climate, microclimate, and climatization, so we felt like that, the perspective of air and atmosphere is something larger than just looking at the scale of the building, and discovering that in Western metaphysics, the performative capacity of air is completely absent. When you look at, into also Heidegger's, description of what space is, that space is empty. It does not have air and atmosphere in it. And, after 2 years of a pandemic, we understand, the amazing capacities of air and atmosphere, and excuse that comparison to connect us. Although this has been an amazing struggle for many people on the planet, on the other side, it was an experience of absolute connection through the medium of air and atmosphere on the planet. And in reading it this way, we understand that any action on any place on the planet affects any place on the rest of the planet. And so this investigation into air and atmosphere really shows that even individual interventions, buildings, right, affect the planet. And I think that is a very strong message to share, that yes, when we design with, vegetation that is not only green, but that is actually part of a living biome, that we transport living matter throughout the planet that is healthy, as we go into the forest, as the Japanese people know so well, in talking about, bathing in forests. We can actually measure a 3-hour experience in a forest. We can measure this for 2 weeks in our bodies. And, that again talks again so much about this interaction that, lies within, us exposing to our built environments. And so in this capacity of air and atmosphere connecting us, lies also so much, I think, potential for design, and Gail was talking about that explicitly, and Fabrizio addressing this also in talking about the individual experiences he made in people living in different climate zones. So I think this is really the key, and it could come out that the pandemic in the end opens an entire universe for us to really go into the design with air and atmosphere in a very new and a very deep way that we haven't in academia been discussing so far.
Yeah, sure, Fabrizio.
About the difficulty with the curriculum at uni. I'm gonna be very quick so we can move on. But I want to use an example of the assignment that I mentioned, where the students, it was a small event center in a rural area in New Zealand, and the students had to, without design, make the building more sustainable or less unsustainable. And the most brilliant assignment was like 5 or 6 years ago, which the student prepared a list of impact that could be caused in that center, and gave to each user a certain amount of emissions capable to use, and they could manage the way that they want. They could eat vegetables, for example. They did not have to turn the lights and so on. There are lots of a list of things, and everyone had a certain share of CO2 to use. And the student prepared a guidance to how to actually achieve those limits of CO2, which was brilliant, a brilliant assignment. So the student got a very high grade. The entire cohort rebelled against it, said, no, this is not architecture. What are you doing? And then there was a discussion, a high level with the university, if that was architecture or not. So we had to change the assignment and provoke to have a little bit of design, because otherwise teaching how people use the building was not directly architecture. And then my questioning always being was like, who will do that? What professional will do that? And then it ended up coming what Klaus said brilliantly and exemplified very well. There's a curriculum problem, which in my case, it's hard to implement. So I just thought it's very important to mention that, because it's something that we can address in a word level, like, okay, the way that you use the building, what Gail also said, right? The way that you relate with the temperature without having to switch an air conditioner on is part of, we should be educating people too. And little by little, we are not anymore, in my point of view.
You bring up a really, really, really important point about domains and the sort of boundaries of our domain, and the way that we may or may not limit the type of knowledge that we elevate in this discussion. I think one thing that's really clear from what we've talked about today, we have about 12 minutes left, is I'm gonna say these things are true, so I can get to a kind of closing question here. That the design of our built environment does support as well as challenge human behavior, and that buildings, landscapes, and cities do have a role in advocating for change or transforming planning values, and your work demonstrates that. There also is a thread in your work about advocacy-based design practices. And I know we don't have enough time to sort of pull that out, but it's very clear as you share with us your work that you are advocating for something, and that you're working towards, you're each individually working towards something very, very specific. I'm really curious about what we don't know. And Klaus, you started with this. There's certain things that we don't know. And what don't we know about adaptation through behavior change and action? Where are gaps in our knowledge? And where is our research heading? So as we look to UIA 2023, I'm curious if we can talk a little bit about that. And Klaus, I wanted to start with you to just sort of pick up on what you just said about breathing and breath and what we've learned from the pandemic. Where do you think our research is heading in this regard?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you ask that question, what is missing, right? We have to know that we know that something is missing. And that is already kind of like quite a challenge, right? And you have to, talk with the Greek philosophers about that, how to unravel the not knowing of not knowing. And so for me, that is, let's say I found my way out is to look at or invite different disciplines basically into that talk. Because suddenly, as I as I shared with you in the beginning, right? So our universe expands, and in more specifically, we work at a technical university, of course. We work with colleagues from different backgrounds and disciplines, and for them it sometimes feels awkward to feel integrated into a design practice. But as we are actually at our university opening the Center for Sustainable Design next week, there is now really an understanding that this capacity it needs to really also bridge into the design disciplines, right? Because architects often are being seen as the artists at technical universities, and so I think we achieved that. There's an amazing capacity of design on the one side to even enrich the understanding of where does technology develop itself towards, to really find that aim. And the other way around, I think, is as important, because you're asking, so what is missing? And again, for me, it's the more than human understanding of planetary cohabitation. And I think that is something that architecture should be very keen on inviting into their discourse for the architectural practice of the future, because the more than human sphere, of course, allows us to address so many planetary aspects that within the limits of architecture we miss even the language for addressing that connectivity and interaction between those different realities on the planet.
Yeah, so it goes back to that word interaction, and we can see, like, even the diagrams that you showed us, we can see this sort of really intense focus on exchanges, but also broadening the conversation. So yes, becoming transdisciplinary really helps us see those gaps. Gail, the CVE has oriented itself to specifically elevate discussions across disciplines. And I'm really curious, from your perspective, what don't we know about adaptation and behavior change? Every time I've seen presentations from your group, the conversation on behavior, or how people are supported in their environments, is always front and present, but I'm always curious, what's next? What don't we know? Where are the gaps? Where's the research heading?
Wow. Well, I'm going to turn that around a little bit, because
Awesome.
The classic researcher answer is we always need more research, right? Isn't that what we always say? I feel like there's so much we actually know. And the question isn't what don't we know, but how to take what we know and make it matter. So I'm going to say I've been on the faculty for 38 years now. And some days I love what I do, but some days I get really depressed, because I know so many smart, brilliant people who have been talking about this for decades. And why is the climate crisis here? Why weren't people listening to us? So the question is not what we know, but how do we get people to pay attention? And one of the things that's really impacted me in the last couple of years is that behavior changed so quickly when the COVID pandemic hit. Wow. I've never seen such a societal change from the individual to the global level. People got it. They or their loved ones might be personally affected. That the magnitude and the urgency of change was unbelievable. So I would ask, what's it going to take for people to get that same sense of urgency about the potential impact of climate change, so that we act quickly in a similar way? And I love the research, and I love CBE, and we're going to keep doing what we're doing, Billy. But true confessions here, there's a part of me that feels like, yeah, we're changing standards and we're giving designers tools. And there's 80% of the time I feel like we're making a huge difference. And the other part of the time, it's like, if we were really making that big of a difference, would we still be talking about this? So I would say, what's it going to take for individuals to feel the same sense of urgency about climate change and that our behavior needs to change? If it was just a fraction as quickly and as intensely as we changed when COVID hit, life would be on the mend.
Thanks for true confessions,
What
Gail.
you were asking.
No, that's
exactly
what I was asking. And Fabrizio, gaps in our knowledge. Where are we? Where's our research heading?
Oh, that's impossible to answer that. But I think I can build up on what Gail said. I also got astonished about the pandemic, especially in New Zealand. Probably you guys hear about what happened in here. We got really engaged on lockdown, and the first lockdown, everybody got together as a community, and everybody stopped buying stuff. Couldn't buy anything. You could buy online, but they wouldn't deliver it because it wasn't essential. It's a major change, and we did. And the answer for what Gail said is because people thought they would die. Would happen with them. So if it happened with me, okay, I'm not doing. The problem with the environment is there is a branch of psychology that study environmental psychology of environment or something like that. I'm sorry about my English is skipping in here, but it says that while people don't perceive as a problem with them, because there is a research in US that say Gallup Institute had this survey saying that I think 40% of Americans believe that the environmental impact will not happen with them. Will happen somewhere else in the world and will not happen in their lifetime. So it covers 2 points that make people not perceive the situation is urgent, because people perceive that's not happening with them. It's going to happen somewhere else because I'm, have a nice house in far from the sea level is just a meter, 1.5 degrees. People don't feel 1.5 degrees. People almost don't feel. And they don't perceive it's going to happen with them. They don't perceive it's going to happen in their region. It's not urgent.
Yeah.
It's not urgent.
No,
and we as designers, we have to fight against it every single day because we are designers, we are scientists, we know where we are going. So the problem, the gap, one of the gaps, if I can say, is that we don't know how hard it is to make people change this perception. We don't know how to make people click, except say like, hey, you're going to die tomorrow because of climate change. But we can't say that. And it's hard to tackle change, behavior change without click, or how Klaus said beautifully in the beginning, open the universe.
I'm going to end on those phrases, open the universe. We were at 6:28 and we had so many more questions. Marguerite, I was hoping that you might come back on. We have 2 minutes left. I want to thank you so much for, I know this was a hard topic. I know that the challenge we put in front of you is quite difficult. And thank you so much for the true confessions and for really tackling this. It's much appreciated, and it really helps us kick off this much larger contemplation on behavior change, and will lead to, we hope, a robust discussion at UIA 2023. Marguerite. Oh, you're muted.
I think I get the hang of it by now. Kia ora, everybody. I'm going to end with another karakia, and this is a way for me to acknowledge the place where I am at the moment, and Fabrizio too, and the people of this place. But it's also a way for us to acknowledge that we've been in this special place together, I suppose, having these conversations, and to in a way kind of release us back into normal life. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara. Kia tūru ki whakataha ai, kia tūru ki whakataka ai, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us, all of you out there.
Thank you so much. What a big pleasure being with you guys.
This was really fun. Loved having a conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Gail.
Really enjoyable. Bye-bye.
Bye.
How awesome was that? You were muted again, maybe you didn't get the hang of it yet.
I know. Oh, am I going to get the hang of it? There's always somebody every time, isn't there? Yeah, wow, that was really great. Synergies between you all. It was fantastic.